It's the 1950s in Plainfield, Wisconsin, a small, quiet town where nothing seems out of place except for one man, Edward Gein. Known around town as a reclusive oddball, to most he was harmless, a local handyman who kept to himself. But behind the doors of his run-down farmhouse, Ed Gein was hiding horrors that would later inspire some of the most terrifying characters in film history. Ed Gein was born in 1906 into a troubled home. His father was an alcoholic, and his mother, Augusta, was a domineering, fanatically religious woman who preached to Ed and his brother about the wickedness of the world, especially women whom she considered sinful. She kept Ed isolated, not allowing him to form friendships or relationships outside of their household. This control over his life deeply affected Ed's psychological development. When Ed's father died and later his brother in a suspicious fire, Ed became entirely dependent on his mother. She was the center of his universe. But when Augusta passed away in 1945, Ed's world shattered. Alone in the farmhouse, he retreated into himself, and slowly his fascination with death and corpses began to consume him. For years, Ed lived alone in his home, but he wasn't just living in solitude, he was committing unthinkable acts. The small town of Plainfield was about to be rocked by a discovery that would leave its residents in shock. In 1957, a local hardware store owner named Bernine Worden went missing. The police traced her last known transaction to Ed Gein, who had been seen in the store that day. When authorities arrived at Gein's farmhouse to investigate, what they found was beyond anything they had ever imagined. Inside, the house was a scene straight out of a nightmare. There were human bones, skin, and body parts scattered throughout the house. Skulls were used as bowls, and lampshades were made out of human skin. Even more horrifying, they discovered a suit made entirely of human flesh, something Gein had crafted in an attempt to replicate his mother's body. The remains of at least 2 women, including Bernice Worden, were found on the property, but Gein confessed to something even more sinister. He had been robbing graves for years, digging up recently buried bodies and using them to create his grotesque collection. Ed Gein's obsession with his mother had driven him to commit these unspeakable acts. In his mind, he believed that by using the skin of this woman, he could bring her back to life, or in some twisted way, become her. His actions went beyond murder and into a deeply disturbed psychological realm that shocked not only the investigators, but the entire world. During his questioning, Gein admitted to the murders of Bernice Worden and Mary Hogan, a local tavern owner who had disappeared 3 years earlier. But it was the grave robbing and the horrific display of human remains that truly set him apart from any other criminal. Ed Gein was declared insane and unfit for trial after his arrest. He was sent to a mental institution where he would spend the rest of his life. But his legacy, if it can be called that, did not end there. Gein's gruesome story became the basis of several iconic horror characters, most notably Norman Bates in Psycho, Leatherface in the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, and Buffalo Bill in The Silence of the Lambs. These fictional representations barely scratched the surface of the real horror that was Ed Gein's life. In 1968, Gein was finally declared fit to stand trial for the murder of Bernice Worden. He was found guilty but was again declared insane and committed to a mental hospital where he remained until his death in 1984. Ed Gein never saw the outside world again, and though his body was buried in the same town that had once feared him, his gravesite was frequently vandalized by those curious about the infamous Butcher of Plainfield. Ed Gein's story is one of psychological horror. A man so deeply disturbed that he blurred the line between life and death, between the living and the dead. His quiet, unassuming life in a rural town hid the darkness within, a darkness that continues to haunt the imagination of filmmakers, writers, and the public to this day. What makes Ed Gein so terrifying is not just the crimes he committed, but the eerie reality that the horror wasn't limited to fiction. The evil that inspired Hollywood's scariest monsters once lived in the real world, and his twisted legacy is a chilling reminder of the depths of human depravity. The life of Ed Gein, a seemingly harmless loner, became one of the most disturbing true crime stories in history. His obsession with death and his monstrous acts continue to captivate and horrify, leaving a permanent mark on both true crime and pop culture.